Welcome to today's episode, How Did Europe Become Europe? The podcast exploring the ideas, history, and politics that shaped Europe not just as a continent, but as a concept and a paradox. I'm your host, Aybars Öztuna, Global Partnerships and Fundraising Lead at the European Integration Group. Today, we are joined by Zeynel Ates, former Turkey Program Manager at the International Republican Institute, who has spent over a decade strengthening civil society, governance, and Turkey's dialogue with Europe. Welcome, Zeynel. Thank you for being with us today. And let me get started with the first question.
Thank you. Happy to be here. Thank you very much.
To what extent can contemporary public religiosity in Turkey be interpreted not as a departure from secular modernity, but as a localized experiment in post-secular governance that mirrors the challenges Europe faces in integrating spirituality with rationalist state structures?
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would say this, first and foremost, I think we have to go with the Turkey, a little bit context on Turkey's own modernization experience, how it came to be to have a better understanding of the both institutional and social implications, which would also inform our understanding of today's differences between how the society and the institutes understand and approach secularism. So as you know, Turkey's modernization history has relatively started in early 19th century. And I believe one of the main differentiating factors in Turkey's history is that at the end of the day, Turkey's modernization decision was not necessarily stem from adapting to a new economic development that also promised a greater wealth for certain parts of the society, or some philosophical driving forcing and value-based enlightenment, etc. It was practically an existential necessity. So I would argue that Turkey's own modernization is quite pragmatic in nature, both in the way it started, why it started, and how it developed. We saw, because we had more industrialized armies being visible around us, like the Ottoman Empire was obviously declining, couldn't compete with its European rivals. So that's how we kind of started, and you can take it all the way to the formation of the Republic, and which is in itself, by definition, a modernization project. And it's quite a unique example I would add. Very effective, very fast, very rapidly institutionalized, canonized through fundamental documents, constitution, etc. But yet you are dealing with a society which is hardly organized population proportionality wise, let alone industrialized. I would say it's quite a unique example. But saying all that in that framework, I think going back to your question, I would argue again, Turkey as a secular state, and as you framed it, a Turkish society with more contemporary or public religiosity. Basically, we are saying you have a conservative, religiously inclined society, but you have a constitutionally and institutionally secular state. That's does it drive a wedge, or as again you framed it, are we talking about a post-secular governance experiment, a localized experiment? I would say I don't think it is a localized experiment. I think if you know where to look, I think this is exactly what we will see in many societies around the world, modernized and secularized. United States, for example. United States is a secular state, republic, and I don't know, does the American society more or less religious on average than Turkish society? Especially the Western European example might be a bit different on this, but again, I don't know how Catholic Polish society, is it more conservative compared to their government or state institutions, probably. So I don't think it is a localized phenomenon. I think the naturally what makes us ask these questions and wonder these aspects is because by a good margin we have to say that Turkey is by far basically the only secular country with a Muslim majority, and within the Muslim world, I think it would be fair to say at this time and place, at this stage of history, most advanced and modernized society and state, integrated fully to the Western system and so forth. Hence, it raises questions like, is it a local? If you look from a religious perspective, you see, if we frame it, is Turkey a more localized example of a secular state structure being prevalent or in a Muslim society within the broader Islamic world? The answer would probably be yes. Not only we don't really see anything similar, we don't see any motivation or hints that there is that kind of a drive, plan, or even from a societal request for that kind of secularization. Sum up your question, I would say, and also the challenges Europe faces in integrating with rational state structures and integrating their spirituality. Again, I don't think Turkey will provide an example for or against to that part of the question, because I personally don't think Turkey and its more conservative society with its more secular state structure does not necessarily qualify as a state or entity that kind of incorporated its society's spirituality to its state structures. Even if so, I think that would be less on the religious side, more on the nationalistic side. The spirituality, even that is more secular, I would say. The spirituality you would see that has been integrated to the state through symbols, rhetorics and whatnot, are more on the nationalistic tone than religious, I would say. So, and I don't know if Europeans do feel the challenge that integrating their spirituality to their rationalist state structures, possibly. But I think what the problem stems from, or the challenge Europe faces, for example, the lack of belief in the ability of mobilization in the need for case of a military conflict, for example. One might say, as the question frames it, if there is some spirituality have been integrated, or society and state has been more on that, more sensitive on that aspect, this might be less of a challenge. But again, I would argue this is less on the religiously driven spirituality related, but more on the more nationalistically driven spirituality, I would argue.
How did Enlightenment era intellectual currents shape divergent models of a secular modernity, French laicite and Turkish laiklik, and what do these divergences reveal about the fractured philosophical foundations of European modernity itself?
And I'm again going to the concepts we are using, what's the difference between laicite and secularism? They're practically the same word with the same meaning, but if instead of secularism, I think the way we can differentiate would be if we use the term secularization versus laicite, maybe. But I would argue again, they do operate philosophically also in the same realm, which very simply laicite is what structures the relationship between the government and the religion, or separation of it. And while if we say secularization, it would mean it refers to more broader social trends and transformations around the religion and religion's role within the state and society. So I think this is also where the philosophical divides or divergences also stem from. Again, divergent, what is a divergent model? Again, going back to modernization, so maybe what we see is, again, very simply, if you go far back enough, the first rule of modernization is urbanization. If you go further back, it's going from hunter-gatherer to the agriculturally sustained society, etc. But then what we're talking about modernity and these concepts is mainly post-industrial revolution and enlightenment, as you also mentioned. You have to industrialize. You have to nationalize. You need to change the way the structure of the society, it's basically being transforming from subject to to citizen. And this, by definition, in itself is also a secularization in itself, because when you're a subject under a monarchy instead of a citizen under a republic, let's say, the authority that is over you has its legitimacy rooted in the divine. Even going from this subject to citizenship, or being a nation instead of a feudal society, again, in my opinion, by definition is a secularization in itself, because you change the source of legitimacy. You take it from the divine, bring it down to the more earthly. And then you need to democratize too. Like, again, all related to the what is the source of the legitimacy, who have the authority to govern over the society. I think this is the main question and main indicator we need to look while examining or discussing or thinking on these divergent cases, or what we try to understand or what we try to mean while using these concepts, and how they apply to the societies and countries in general. Just to maybe a bit expand on this, as far as I understand from the way the question has been framed, like we are arguing that the French model of laicity and Turkish model, which is quite related to, are the divergent cases of the Europe's philosophy of enlightenment. There are two divergent cases that has been secularized in the way they do, and no other country or society has went that way. That's how I understand the question. But I'm not sure, again, there are divergent cases in a sense that if you use what I tried to earlier explain, the term secularization with the broader implications of more societal changes and transformations. Yes, but if you look for the more like definitive laicity and who is in Europe is secular in that sense, I would make an argument which can be quite amusing too. If there's a monarchy in place as a head of state, head of armed forces, which is hereditary, then you cannot talk about a secular state structure. You can talk about a secular society they operate over or exert authority over. By definition, the state cannot be classified as secular, because again, going back to the source of the legitimacy, like the source of the legitimacy is divine in any monarchy's case. It's not popular. It's not from the public. And in Europe's case, coming to more recent times, I think what we see is, and why this, like any Scandinavian country, Spain, UK, Netherlands, Belgium, are they secular state countries? They are certainly secularized and modernized societies. Are they secular states? So going back to the questions, divergent, Turkish and French cases being the divergent argument, I would argue that they're not necessarily divergent because they're not diverging from the mainstream in a way, like there's no that many examples who transformed their statehoods or their state structure into this more secularized version. Like there are only a few examples of it. So it's not like this would produce an additional argument that in Europe's case, mainly, I think US is a different case that would be more akin to French and Turkish cases in that sense. But in Europe's case, secularization on state level, not social level, but on state level, has not been the norm or mainstream.
Can the Turkish experience of reform and modernization be read as an experiment in civilizational translation, where concepts such as sovereignty, law, and progress are adapted rather than imported wholesale?
Yes, I think so. Yes, I think adaptation rather than import is a good way. And I think this is, again, I would like to, as we are asking, like, when did Europe become Europe? We can talk more modern times on this, like inter-war period, post-World War II period, post-Cold War period. And we have all these phases, which a lot of different arguments can emerge from. If we go far back enough, like in a political sense, Turkey, or like the Turkish state or Turkish presence, has always been more relevant and incorporated to the European political picture rather than another Eastern or even Islamic political picture. So on one hand, from a political history point of view, Turkey is organic actor in the European history, and Europe is a very organic actor in Turkish political history. But culturally, most certainly, there is adaptation rather than import, which is only natural. And again, maybe for comparison, we can see like what would be an import rather than adaptation makes us say what Turkey did is the latter rather than the former. Maybe the American case might comparison or example on this, because that is basically a colonial tax feud turning into a revolutionary war, which has formed a new state and a political entity in the new world. But on principles it has been built upon, or like the society that it has emerged from is purely European. The models or like the ideas, as far as I can see, they've been like practically imported, because it was very organic for them. George Washington fought in the British Royal Army as an officer before he fought against them and became the first president. And were there any other cultural heritage that necessitates adaptation rather than flat out importing these values and whatnot? Not necessarily there was, but there was kind of disregarded in the and even if these Louisiana purchases, etc., like you see French influence, you see Spanish influence. They're all European. Like the native influences have not only considered, obviously, completely disregarded. Like that was not, it was a non-factor. Philosophical formation of the ideals and the institutes of the new republic. So that would be an import case, I think. And I'm not sure we can find a second example to it. Maybe like we look at the more recent post-colonial former colonies of these European powers in the Middle East and Africa, or maybe in Asia too. I don't know, maybe India would be a good example of adaptation rather than import, just like Turkey. But what makes Turkey, again, unique, in my opinion, in this case, is we are talking in all these examples, all these cases, talking about whether it's an import or an adaptation, some sort of a colonial relationship was kind of the impetus or like the prime mover of these things. Be it modernization, be it institutionalization, whatnot. It's not the case in Turkey. It's very organic and it's very local in a sense. It comes from within, rather top to bottom than bottom to top. But it is not from outside to inside, but it's kind of comes organically from within, local actors, etc. So I would agree, to summarize, like sovereignty law, progress. These are all adapted rather than wholesale import. But yeah, and these are all, of course, obviously huge impact on Turkish culture, political culture too, especially like what for costed and then benefited in the long run, I would say. French Revolution, of course, like these kind of ideas, the nationalism, the nation state ideas, etc., which practically like crippled the empire in the early stage. Force for modernization to address an existential threat, and through that modernization period, like that produced the ideas and the people and the society that afterwards founded and created this more modern nation state, and then to survive and hopefully flourish in this new modern era.
To what extent does Europe's self-definition as a rational and secular civilization depend on juxtaposition with an Oriental other, and how does this epistemic positioning continue to shape cultural and political hierarchies?
Certainly, I personally believe it's certainly, if not depends entirely, it's very vital to that argument. And it's not necessarily Oriental other, like it's also, we can say maybe the broader term we can use would be the colonial other. We can do it through geography, race, religion, doesn't matter, but the hierarchy. And this is a tough topic to navigate in a sense. It is, to a certain extent, I think we have to acknowledge the fact that, especially in these transformative eras, that kind of civilizational or cultural hierarchy is inescapable, let's say. Not preferable, obviously, but it is a vital component for many reasons, cultural, political, and again, maybe we can go a little bit to US, the American example, maybe like this meets 19th century, like after the formation of the United States, maybe like after the formation and before the Civil War. These you see these things like these terms, these like these books being written, these papers are being written, like using the terms like white man's burden, for example, like the mission to civilize, like the enslavement of the non-European populations, or subjugation, or let's not say enslavement. The subjugation is in itself is a civilizational act, because that's how they kind of like rub shoulders with the civilization through their European masters, and then with that knowledge and experience and through the natural progress, they will end up being more civilized or forming their own civilization. So this kind of in a society where this kind of thinking is accepted, the hierarchy of the Oriental other, or any other for that matter, like the idea of Oriental other or any other, and creating a civilizational hierarchy through that is necessary to, I think, to convince the society also what you are doing, and also to a certain extent, however weak an argument that might be, it's like a more of a historical legitimacy argument. Like, you cannot just say we are enslaving and subjugating these people because we want to get rich, because we have more guns, so they have to obey us. It's a white man's burden, basically, because we are the civilized ones. We are bringing the human race and like the civilizational progress to the next level. So as long as it is for that progress, and since we are the ones doing that progress, so there is a hierarchy, again, by definition.
How can we understand the tension between universalist ideals and local adaptations in both European and Turkish intellectual histories, particularly in the governance of pluralistic societies?
I just realized I haven't responded to the last part of the previous question, that like how does it shape, or does it continue to shape cultural and political hierarchies? Yeah, it's a very difficult question like this. To a certain extent, I think obviously it's not shaping as it used to, obviously, but we are operating. It's not like this is less relevant to Turkish case, but more relevant to post-colonial countries and their former like the colonial subjugators. Okay, yes, it's not the same now, and now you are equal, on paper, equal nation states, like recognized in UN and whatnot, but they have emerged from the system and like centuries of subjugation. So I would guess that it is quite a difficult societal and mental barrier to breach, and possibly even the animosity they might have is quite hard to forget too. Like maybe just as an example from Turkish context would be like what we call, you would know this, our European friends may not be very familiar, but like this, what we call the Sèvres syndrome. And this is just practically a couple of years of occupation following the defeat in the World War I and prior to the War of Independence and the formation of the Republic. But we see even today, like in every political and social, it's cross-cutting. Like you see in the rich educated people, you see in the poor uneducated people, you see in the more secular nationalistic groups, you see in the more conservative groups. That it doesn't matter. Like if anything happens, like everyone wants to carve us up. Our treaty allies by treaty, which like mutually like pledged to come to each other's aid militarily if need arises. We build there's a maybe not significant but meaningful proportion in the society that would believe that our treaty allies would come and occupy the Turkish territory and carve it up if they find the opportunity. And this is just from our example, the impact it has in a country that has never been colonized. We don't have that kind of experience. We don't have that kind of historic cultural impact or burden. But yet, even that affects us in a way that it's quite hard to reverse. And I can only imagine what it would be in these colonial, post-colonial states would have to their Western counterparts. Sorry, I don't want to leave it unanswered.
No, that's excellent. Thank you for covering that. And what might Turkey's historical oscillation between multiple political and philosophical traditions, Ottoman, Islamic, European, serve as a lens to rethink the coherence and theology of Western modernity itself?
Like if you look Ottoman, Western, Islamic, and maybe Republican, we can as the product of the three distinct philosophical traditions. I think again, we first and foremost, I think we have to make the distinction on what we are trying to examine on the impact of these philosophical traditions. Are we talking about more societal or state? I think
it's more of a state question, should be.
Yeah, political tradition and or political culture wise. I would argue the rationalistic, or like, if Turkish political culture is extremely pragmatic in a sense that, like, it would use Islamic cultural components if need be. It would use Western, incorporate also, not just use, incorporate Western traditions and philosophies and ways of thinking or culture, etc. if it serves a purpose. And same with the Ottoman or if even the steppe traditions, like, if need be, and which you may make the argument, which in itself is quite rationalistic way of politics, or the way to approach politics, which again, as an extension, is quite modern. And with regards to coherence of, you said coherence and theology, right?
Right.
But I think it opens a door to quite an interesting comparison, because I think in the West case, especially for Europe, let's say, in the development of their political culture and their modernization, the role of religion or their theology, the role of Judeo-Christian values, the role of church is incomparably more significant than in Turkey's, the role of the Islamic tradition and values in Turkey's own modernization and forming of its political culture.
Completely agree, yeah.
Which I find quite fascinating and interesting, because maybe that is also what propelled or motivated or mobilized this European Enlightenment, with this rationality coming into picture and whatnot. But I think there's a good trust in that sense. So from a certain perspective, it provides an excellent lens to observe Europe's case, because when you how it is the role of religion, the impact of religion on the development of political culture and political institutions.
How does the Turkish case problematize linear narratives of progress, illustrating that modernity can be plural, layered, and non-exclusive rather than singular and Eurocentric?
I think the main argument here would be can the Turkish case be an example of a modernization which is not necessarily fully European-centric, non-European modernization with European components? Am I understanding it correct?
Yes.
Again, I think, yes, certainly there is a case to be made, but I cannot differentiate Turkey or decouple Turkey from Europe and its political history and culture and geography and economy, etc., to a degree that I can make the argument that it is not necessarily Eurocentric. I think to a certain extent Turkey's modernity or modernization is a Eurocentric one, and we have to, I think, remember that, which also there is academic criticisms to that. It was the case to a certain extent in Turkey too, not just in Turkey, but also in Turkey too, when there's a reflex or there's this way of thinking that when you say modernization, you automatically mean, or many people automatically think, knowingly or unknowingly, Westernization. In Turkey's case, this is probably not very far off from the reality. Turkey's modernization was quite a westernized modernization. I think we have to acknowledge it, which also I believe quite natural because of the space Turkey occupied, both historically, geographically, and politically. And it's impossible to ignore that. It's just the interaction is inevitable, and your trade partners are there, your existential threats are coming from there, your expansion routes are going through there, in whatever era you are looking for. So I think Turkish case instead of problematizing this Eurocentric modernization, I think it kind of enhances it, to be frank. And I'm thinking again some examples that we can compare. I think maybe the Russian, like the Soviet model, maybe might be a different example than the
Is an alternative.
well, Eurocentric example, but it doesn't necessarily have the same component as the European one,
Right.
but from the economic and industrialization component or perspective, certainly provided a different model. Because if you look at like the Japanese case, it's quite Western-centric too, from even to the clothing. This is again, I think this also relates to some of the previous questions. Like at this stage, do we have any model of modernization that doesn't also bring within a westernization? Again, India, China, we maybe not really well read on those countries. I don't know, but regarding this question, but again, this non-exclusive, like Turkey, or again, Turkish culture, tradition, the one chance Turkey had, and like kind of enabled it to become this unique case in this whole history or whole case of modernization, is we have Europeanized in a time when Europe was not modernized. So it was a very, very early meetup, very early interaction, and in that time, with the ebbs and flows, so you come to a point where the Western modernization, with again industrialization, secularization, etc., they were coming to the play. I think the Turkish culture was in a way formed. They had their own individual characteristics, quite consolidated, but at the same time have been quite open to adapt European or other components when necessary. I think that's the one advantage of how the history has been unfolded. I think that's that's a way to. This is an argument I think that can be made. It needs further discussion, obviously, but I think it's a role.
You mentioned academic criticism, and my following question is from one of the scholars' approach, and that is, could Turkey's gradual decentering from the European project represent a failure of Westernization, a new mode of modernity that provincializes Europe itself? That's what Dipesh Chakrabarty suggested.
Okay, again, I have some disagreements with this. I agree on the broader argument that and it's not, I think, necessarily European issue, but a more global issue. This is, and I would argue it's more of a geopolitical issue than a political philosophy or cultural issue. But the disagreements I would have with this statement is, first and foremost, like, is Turkey decentering from decoupling from the European project? I don't know, maybe, but the examples or like the reasons that are being put forth to strengthen this argument is not convincing yet. Turkey is doing trade with Russia or buying Russian military equipment. Then you may not agree. I personally don't think it was a great idea, but I don't think it's like an institutional breakup scenario. I think this level of arguments needs a bit more significant proofs for this. First and foremost, again, like trade numbers are going up, the security cooperation is increasing. For every argument you can make, the European project, Turkey is, as far as I can follow, like every single Turkish official in every single opportunity and every single topic regarding Europe is always emphasizing that full membership to the European Union is a strategic goal, which Turkey is not diverting from. And so that's not necessarily the main component or main argument of this the statement, but I just don't like these kind of big framings or big arguments using this arbitrarily. On the second part, again, failure of Westernization. Again, as I tried to explain in the previous question, I think we have to accept and acknowledge the fact that Turkey's own modernization is by and large a Westernization, from the shape and structures of the institutions, like the codified laws and legislations, even the clothing, and just like the Japanese case, quite a westernized model of modernization. So And at this, what does modernization or modernity would mean in, because this is a contemporary argument, like this argument and statement deals with the contemporary political framework, what is happening right now, like geopolitically and in foreign policy wise. And in the contemporary sense, what is the next stage of modernization? Is it, I don't know, maybe it's no longer Westernization, maybe it's something more symbiotic, maybe it's something more oriental this time, I don't know, we'll see. Or maybe, because main thing I don't understand in this is this new mode of modernity. What does that mean? Like the provincializing, what are we transforming into? What is, like, this applies to many countries in the world economically, or the welfare we can create for our citizens may not be at the level of some more developed European countries, but there's no difference in modality, that they are doing something different in, like, it's a free market economy with social welfare state, etc., like, you know, you have these communal aspects which some can adapt more successfully, some may not, but the modality, as a modality, there's no disagreement. Like, you know, this it's not like we have this very centralized closed economy with no private sector or whatnot. And this is, like, we cannot explain the lack of, like, welfare compared to some Western countries or GDP per capita, etc., by the differences in the approach to modernity. I would have to disagree.
That leads to my next and last question, which is, if Europe was historically a civilizational project built on exclusion and hierarchy, can it still serve as a moral reference point in a multipolar world? And what does Turkey's trajectory tell us about the limits of the European ideal today?
First and foremost, I would say, I don't think morality is, like, everyone tries to have the moral high ground, but in civilizational arguments or claim, especially, which also at the same time claims to be a moral reference point, quite a vain, inconsequential effort. Because let's be clear about what human civilization really is. It's history and wars and blood. So Europe project, I think we can very easily and rightfully say European Union is a project of peace, but mainly in the European continent, not to really the devastation of the world wars, which has been quite successful. And I would say for until quite recently, like maybe until the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was these ideals, these values, this as the question states, the reference morality. But unfortunately, they've been tested to act upon those values and morals, but they failed to do so. So I think at this stage, like, their claims of value-based systems, them being the most important aspects of their existence, is quite a harder sell now, I would say, compared to a couple of years ago. But doesn't, again, if you look comparatively, I think, again, obviously, Europe is what Europe become, has a lot of reference points for any country and society should at least partially, like, influenced and inspired by. But for this, I would also, like, Europe again. Like, when did Europe become Europe? Like, what are we talking about? Like Spain in the 70s? Are we talking about Romania in 60s? Or like the other or divided Germany in the 80s? I think if you go to the big World War II, like, none of these, like, democracy-related values not necessarily existed institutionally. They are all Eurocentric values. Obviously, all of their source is in the European Enlightenment, no question. Institutionalized versions of those have quite a while, and would argue mainly that came back to the continent to be institutionalized by the Americans after the World War II, and then after incorporating the post-Soviet countries, the Baltics and the Balkans, etc., back to the European project. Like, no one argues that Ceausescu's Romania was a more reference point, I assume. And morality in Europe, I think we have to also say, it is not quite a Judeo-Christian sources of it, which is, again, natural. Religion usually, especially pre-modernity, religion is kind of the only source of morality. But Turkey's own trajectory, and Turkey's trajectory in this sense looking forward, or what Turkey was and became up until this time. I don't think it says anything about the limits of European ideals because, again, from a geopolitical standpoint, at this stage, currently Turkey is quite an important regional actor now, and I would argue quite comfortable in dealing with its European allies compared to a couple of years ago, given the circumstances. But the European ideals politically and intellectually and socially keeps they are still the main reference points for Turkey. We are still aspiring to be a member of the European Union. We are still aspiring to be to establish a better and more institutionalized democracy, rule of law, etc. These are all European ideals at the end of the day, and European ideals which are now practically the global reference point. So I don't think that the Turkey's own trajectory tells us anything about European ideals today, but I think the main issue and problem is, main thing that if you want those ideals, what main European power is now showing us, if you want those ideals to be alive and well and continue to be reference points, you just need to have the strength and will also to act upon them. I think that's the main philosophical crisis of Europe at the moment, because it is being tested, with this a lot of tragedies around the world now, some closer to Europe than others, and a lot of aggression and types of acts that Europe would very confidently argue that they would not just watch and do nothing, but when tested, they were quite incapable of. And unfortunately, when the global politics demand evolves into more hard power, becoming the more valid currency than soft power, you need to find ways to reintegrate these values and maybe preserve them, or just to remind people that they do matter. But we'll see. They have with all that being said, I think Europe has the capacity and accumulated know-how to adapt to this new dynamics. But I'm not sure if they have the political will to do so. I think the capacity is there, but we'll see. If they can adapt, if they can become more of a appropriate actor to this new times, I think we will see those values are being, to a certain extent, become more be reference points again.
That wraps up this episode. We have talked in depth about how Europe became Europe for an hour. Thank you, Zeynel, for your time and exceptional answers.
Thank you very much.